Okay, we're at the top of the hour, so let's go ahead and get started. I would like to welcome everyone to the Foley and Lardner webinar. It's Electrifying, Environmental, Regulatory, Policy, and Sustainability, Developments in Impacting Electric and Other Zero-Emission Vehicles. And now we are going to go over a few housekeeping items. When our PowerPoint would like to move. Dewana, can you go ahead and give me control? Okay, a few housekeeping items for today. If you experience any technical difficulties, please leave the meeting, refresh your browser, and rejoin. If you have any questions about any of today's topics, please type your question into the chat, and we will address questions time permitting. Please include your name and email. That way we can address your questions should we run out of time and unable to answer during the program. This is applicable for CLE credit. So Foley will apply for CLE credit after the program where applicable. To be eligible for CLE, you will need to be logged into the Microsoft Teams meeting for the full duration of the program, and your first and last name must be displayed in the participant list. To ensure accuracy, please feel free to enter your first and last name and your email address upon entering the meeting for CLE credit. Please also complete the attorney affirmation form with a 5-digit CLE course code, which will be announced later in the program. The attorney affirmation form will be found in the Microsoft Teams chat. Please sign and return the form to Sam Beisecker immediately following the program. And now I will turn it over to Lynn Perrins, Senior Counsel in our Business Law Department, to go over the agenda. Lynn, over to you.
Thank you, Mary.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. This is Amanda Beggs. I'm going to jump in with the agenda here. Thanks, Lynn. If you can move the slides forward, that'd be great.
Yeah.
So first, hello, everybody. My name's Amanda Beggs, and I'm a senior counsel in Foley's Milwaukee office. I'm a member of the environmental practice group, and my practice focuses on all areas of environmental, including particularly relevant for this webinar, Clean Air Act and state regulation related to vehicles, equipment, and aftermarket parts. So I want to thank you all for participating in this discussion. We appreciate the opportunity to speak with you regarding environmental, regulatory, and policy updates related to electric and zero-emission vehicles. I know these topics are certainly front of mind for at least front of email inbox or newsfeed for many of us at this time. It seems like I can't really go a day or even a couple hours without seeing developments in this space. So we're excited to talk about some of those developments with you today. So with that, I'll jump right in. First, Lynn Perrins will be discussing the EV adoption and market trends, as well as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act from this past November and related federal guidance and implications for EV infrastructure. Lynn is a senior counsel in our Madison office, and he's the co-lead of Foley's Electrified Mobility and Infrastructure team. His practice focuses on project finance and commercial contracting for renewable energy, energy efficiency, and sustainable development projects, which has recently extended to electric vehicles and related infrastructure. After that, I will talk about the Biden administration's executive orders on electric fleets and his overall EV policy so far, as well as environmental regulatory considerations for zero-emission vehicles. Then I will turn it over to Nick England, who will talk about National Highway Traffic Safety Administration regulatory considerations. And Nick is a special counsel in our Washington, D.C. office. He's a member of the Government Relations Practice Area, and his practice area focuses on vehicle safety regulations at the federal and state level, including NHTSA and the Fmvss regulations. Prior to joining Foley, Nick was a trial attorney with NHTSA's Chief Counsel Office. And then last but not least, Hillary Bedvig we'll discuss sustainability considerations in the EV space. And Hillary is an associate in our Madison office, practicing in the environmental group. And in addition to federal and state environmental law, she focuses on sustainability and environmental, social, and governance, ESG issues. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lynn, who's going to talk about EV adoption and market trends.
Thank you, Amanda.
Thanks.
Okay, so as Amanda noted in her opening remarks, EVs are top of mind for virtually everyone that's paying attention to the automotive industry right now. Even a casual observer of the news would know that electric vehicles are commonly talked about, and the major manufacturers are now staking their futures on an electric future, with targets to transition their fleets and offerings from internal combustion engines to battery electric vehicles and also plug-in hybrid electric vehicles over the coming decade and beyond. Not to mention the other electric vehicle specific startups that we're seeing more and more, Tesla being the common name, Rivian, Lucid, Canoo, and many others that are entering this competitive landscape. Now, as noted on the slide, that the market overall for vehicles is complicated by a lot of the things that we've been talking for 2 years related to the pandemic, shutdowns, social distancing regulations, and also commodity price increases. So this transition that we're seeing from traditional combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles, while there's an incredible amount of excitement toward it, there's the complicating factors that we're experiencing on all sides of the industry right now. And notwithstanding that hasn't stopped the interest in electric vehicles and the focus on the automotive sector generally. The overall transaction and pace has picked up in 2021, like the M&A volume that was very active overall. The automotive industry definitely experienced that as well. And we have some figures on the slide for the volumes that the automotive industry generally saw. And a lot of that interest and activity was focused on a lot of the new EV startups and EV offerings that manufacturers are putting together. And a lot of these are being done via special purpose acquisition company vehicles, and Foley has participated in some of those as well. Underpinning that interest are, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of big announcements around the electric vehicle manufacturing and also the components that are necessarily going into them, such as battery plants being constructed in Michigan and elsewhere, North Carolina, Georgia, and other places that are not commonly part of the supply chain for the automotive industry are now being talked about. And I think we'll see that more and more as overall interest in the EV market continues. The next slide that I am going to will give us a pictorial description of some of the trajectories that people are anticipating for EV adoption. And sorry, apologies, bear with me while I get the slides to cooperate. Okay, so this slide will show what some industry observers are anticipating for adoptions of electric vehicles over the coming decade. And you'll see, right now in 21, relatively low numbers of electric vehicle or plug-in hybrid electric vehicle adoption, with fairly high increased growth for the next decade, which coincides with the projections that and announcements that manufacturers have put forward, and which will also depend on adoption by consumers. Here's the cumulative electric vehicles that were anticipated to have in operation, and as people buy new ones, they're of course going to be in operation, will need to be maintained, will have components that need to be recycled, batteries being a key component of them, which my colleagues will talk about a bit further. Now, just to give a high-level overview of some of the federal policy developments, specifically in the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, a lot of what is in the bill, or some of what was in the bill, is targeted at EV charging infrastructure. In order to accommodate the significant increase in EV adoption, people will need dependable charging options that go not only in their homes, but also for long over the road trips. And the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program is focused on catalyzing some of that adoption, with $5 billion dedicated to that program. The guidelines were issued in February. It depends on state plans being adopted, and those are due in August, and then the Federal Highway Administration will need to approve them by the end of September. So there's still some time before we'll really know how these plans will be implemented and the funds that have been allocated to that will be put out there. There's, in addition, a competitive grant program that does not, unlike the formula program, will be competitive, meaning you'll be able to put an RFP out there, and there's no guaranteed amount that will be going to any specific state or project, whereas the $5 billion program is dedicated money on a state-by-state basis. Now, in addition to passenger cars, buses are a big focus in the infrastructure bill. $5 billion for zero-emission school buses, and then an additional $5.6 billion for lower no-emission transit buses, so mass transit infrastructure. And then, it's worth mentioning as well that mobility will extend to not just land mobility, but also sea, and there's a $250 million for electric or low-emitting ferry technology. The guidance for these additional programs has not been issued yet, but we are paying attention to those guidances as they come out, and we'll have more details at that time. Just a little bit more detail on the NEVI formula program. There's, as I mentioned, $7.5 billion total, the goal being to have 500,000 EV charging stations by 2030. And they'll be really targeted at alternative fuel corridors that the federal government has put out there to cover basically most major highways across the country. Here's just a brief snapshot of some of the components that the federal government will be looking for in these formula programs. And the overarching message is really that they want these programs to be inclusive, to be considering public-private partnerships and other stakeholders beyond state governments. So there certainly will be opportunity for the private sector to get involved in the implementation of EV charging infrastructure through these programs that will be further catalysts of interest and activity in the EV space. So with that, Amanda, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Lynn. So next, we're going to turn to some of the environmental regulatory considerations for zero-emission vehicles. And I first want to start out with some of the policy actions of the Biden administration related to electric vehicles that have spurred recent environmental regulation from the US EPA. Sorry, bear with me with the slides here for a moment. while I think I'm getting control of the slides from Dewana, I'll go ahead and start talking about some of those steps by the Biden administration. So starting with August 2021, the Biden administration issued an executive order on strengthening American leadership in the clean cars and trucks space. And since that time, the government has implemented various incentives for EV manufacture and infrastructure, spurring public and private partnerships, which I know Lynn mentioned earlier. There we go, perfect. The August 2021 executive order set a new target of all vehicle sales into the U.S. being zero emission or electric vehicles of 50% by 2030. And this is consistent with Biden's stated goals of building 500,000 electric vehicle chargers throughout the country. So next slide, if somebody can advance for me, please. The August 2021 order kicked off the EPA rulemaking with respect to new greenhouse gas emission standards that we're going to talk about in greater detail in a moment. But in another action in December 2021, Biden also issued another executive order directing the federal government to decarbonize by 2050. And as part of this directive, this would apply to limiting or reducing greenhouse gas emissions from federal vehicle fleets, as well as in federal procurement and in other buildings. So that will lead to a push for zero emission vehicles in federal fleets. And then more recently in President Biden's State of the Union, he emphasized that the U.S., and he spoke at length, needs to decrease its dependence on foreign oil and expand its reliance on clean energy. And he cited, expanding access to electric vehicles using tax credits as a means to do that. If we could move to the next slide, that would be great. And then each of these actions by the Biden administration paved the way for EPA to issue more stringent greenhouse gas emission standards for light duty vehicles and passenger cars and trucks in December 2021. Sorry, can somebody please move the slides forward for me? I'd appreciate it. Thank you. Right here is perfect. So that rulemaking includes the most stringent greenhouse gas emission standards to date, and those start with model year 2023, which is right around the corner, and they continue through 2026. The previous standards, just for frame of reference, required fuel efficiency standard improvements of about 1.5% per year. And these new standards that were enacted in December 2021 now require 5 to 10% in improvements per year, and also will require fuel efficiency economy labels to reach 40 miles per gallon on average by model year 2026, as opposed to what was expected, the 32 mile per gallon fuel economy label under the current rules. So just with those few data points, you can see that these rules are particularly stringent for greenhouse gas emissions from light duty passenger cars and trucks. And this effectively will push manufacturers to at least incorporate some electric vehicles or other zero emission vehicles, hydrogen fuel cell powered vehicles, into their production lineups by model year 2026 to meet these standards. If we could move to the next slide, that would be great. So just by way of example, the EPA put out some numbers with respect to EV sales and what they anticipate based on these new standards. And they said that by model year 2026, they expect that at least 17% of all vehicle sales will have to be electric vehicles or zero emission vehicles for manufacturers to meet these new standards. And that compares to the anticipated 7% market share for 2023 model year right now. So that more than doubles the anticipated need for electric vehicles to meet the emission standards. Right now there are challenges to the rule from various groups, including some fuel formulators and other industry groups. But if these do remain in place, they will drive changes to the automotive supply chain, demand for electric powertrains and other electric light vehicle components. And then also outside of the automotive space, there will, be requirements for people in power producers, transmission organizations, and other electric retailers to make updates for infrastructure purposes due to the increased market share of electric vehicles to ensure grid stability and just to make sure that there's enough electric charging stations to support the increase in this market share. If we could move forward a slide or two to the next slide, please. So that was, the enacted rules for December 2021 for light duty passenger vehicles and trucks. And since that time, things are moving quick in this space. On March 7th, US EPA also issued proposed rules, more stringent emission standards for heavy duty vehicles and engines starting in 2027. So beyond passenger vehicles, EPA is also now proposing more stringent standards for heavy duty vehicles and those class of vehicles. What EPA is calling the Clean Trucks Plan would reduce NOx or nitric NOx, and set updated greenhouse gas standards for school buses and transit buses and different types of trucks and trailers. And those more stringent emission standards would, have the similar effects to the rules for light duty vehicles in terms of pushing towards more electrification and zero emission technologies, and similar effects on the supply chain and then also infrastructure. If we could move to the next slide, please. And while we see, those are the two main regulatory actions we're seeing out of EPA in this space right now related to basically just increasing the stringency of emission standards that will effectively push market adoption of electric vehicles and zero emission vehicles, at least to some extent. But we anticipate that EPA will continue to develop regulations in this area. For example, they haven't addressed non-road equipment yet or anything in that space, so we might see more in that area. But as you might imagine, California is already very active in this space as well, and there are a number of things we can discuss in terms of the regulations related to electric vehicles in California. One of which being the reinstatement of the California Air Resources Board Clean Air Act waiver, the issued Advanced Clean Trucks Rule, Governor Newsom's executive order related to electric vehicles and zero emission vehicles, the proposed Clean Fleets Rule, and the proposed Advanced Clean Cars Rule. And we'll talk about each of those in turn. If we could move to the next slide. Thank you. So the California waiver reinstatement, overall, the federal government is responsible for setting emission standards nationally. And under the Clean Air Act, there's a prohibition on states setting their own emission standards, which generally makes sense and given the fact that cars move all over the country and emissions affect the country in that way. Except under Section 209 of the Clean Air Act, California can obtain a waiver from EPA, which will allow it to introduce its own more stringent or different emission standards or other mandates related to emissions. And Section 177 of the Clean Air Act allows other states to adopt California's standards after they promulgate them. So up until 2019, however, the US EPA had granted all of California's waiver requests and their requests to implement their own emission standards. But in 2019, the Trump administration withdrew California's Clean Air Act waiver authority and took away their authority to implement more stringent or different standards than at the national level. And this was related primarily to stopping CARB from enforcing certain fuel efficiency standards for light duty vehicles. On March 9th of this year, the US EPA, however, reissued that waiver, allowing California to pursue its own tailpipe greenhouse gas emission standards and also other zero emission mandates or goals or directives. So that's been reinstated. If we could move to the next slide, please. And even before EPA reissued California's Clean Air Act waiver, California has been developing numerous regulations related to zero emission vehicles in this space, one of which being the July 2020 Advanced Clean Trucks Rule, which was really the first of its kind and setting basically phase-ins of zero emission vehicles for heavy duty vehicles. This particular rule was promulgated as part of California's target for carbon neutrality by 2045. And the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule relates specifically to heavy duty highway vehicles. And some of these other targets we'll talk about too in greater detail with respect to some of the other rules, but you'll see that the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule set a 100% zero emission drayage trucks goal by 2035, and some of the other rules are moving towards 100% of sales into California being zero emission by 2035 or 2045. With respect to the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule, other states under that authority, Section 177 of the Clean Air Act, have adopted the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule: Oregon, Washington, New York, New Jersey, and Massachusetts. And there's many others that are either exploring or have proposed rules to sort of mirror the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule and phasing in over certain time periods, electric heavy duty highway vehicles. If we could move to the next slide, please. And just a comment on how the implementation of this is going and what California is doing to implement the enacted Advanced Clean Truck Rule. They're focusing on their public fleets, drayage fleets, and then, as I said, starting in late 2023, which is just around the corner here, really, all drayage trucks, in order to be listed on CARB's truck registry, they have to be zero emission. So just as another sort of added incentive, I guess, or layer of meeting the goals stated in the regulations. And by 2035, all drayage trucks would be required to be zero emission, with some medium and other heavy duty vehicle sales being zero emission in 2040 in those rules. Can we move to the next slide, please? So after that sort of initial regulation, sort of the first of its kind coming out of California, there's been sort of a push for more regulation in the same vein. And in September 2020, Governor Newsom took it a step further and issued an executive order basically directing CARB to develop regulations requiring that all vehicles and off-road equipment be zero emission by 2035. So he, basically the executive order tagged on to the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule, but took it further into all classes of vehicles. So CARB is currently in the process of drafting a number of proposed rules to meet these directives, and they're in various states of completeness, I would say. Could we move to the next slide, please? And two of those that I just want to highlight here are the Advanced Clean Fleets Rule and the Advanced Clean Cars 2 Rule. In 2021, CARB issued the Advanced Clean Fleets Rule, and this is for medium and other heavy duty zero emission fleets with the goal of having a zero emission truck and bus fleet in California that is 100% zero emission by 2045. Those rules have been proposed and they're currently, be in the comment period, but that's one step that CARB is taking to meet the executive order directives. And then the second one I wanted to touch on here is the Advanced Clean Cars rule, which builds on the Advanced Clean Cars 1 rule. The Clean Cars 2 rule is in development to enact more stringent greenhouse gas emission standards for light vehicles, so passenger cars and trucks, and also include additional zero emission targets for light duty vehicles. So both of these rules, similar to the ones proposed and enacted by EPA, will certainly increase the demand for zero emission vehicle components for vehicles sold into California, like electric powertrains and other components, and will also require additional investment and updates for infrastructure for electric chargers, and a number of parties will need to be involved in that. If we could move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So those were some of the current environmental regulatory developments, the rulemakings at the federal level and in California, specifically related to emission standards and electric vehicle and zero emission vehicle targets. But now I kind of want to turn to more of the nuts and bolts of some of the EPA and CARB certification process that aren't necessarily intuitive in this space, but I think are nevertheless important to touch on. So, some of you may be very familiar with the EPA and CARB certification requirements and emissions related requirements, but it's not, especially for new market entrants in the automotive space, it is not necessarily clear that a vehicle that doesn't produce any emissions would still have to get an emissions certification from the federal government or from California. But starting with EPA, there are still certification procedures, reporting, and labeling requirements for zero emission vehicles. The process at the federal level is typically the same generally as for more traditional vehicles or vehicles with internal combustion engines, ICs, except there's no emissions testing requirement. So that the procedures are similar. You still have to, as a manufacturer of a vehicle, sign up with EPA and get an engine manufacturer code, apply for certification, and then maintain documentation to support your your emission statements in your application. So, or the lack thereof of emissions, you need to maintain documentation of that. And there's certainly, very detailed procedures and processes for what the application looks like that are beyond the scope of what I'm going to talk about here, but at a high level, those are some of the requirements. And also wanted to note that that process is for zero emission vehicles. There's, a different separate process for hybrid vehicles or vehicles with some emissions. That application will look a bit different and the requirements will look a bit different. And then electric vehicles have to be labeled as such. And since the focus is less on emissions, the label will be required to include a number of things, including driving range and charge time. If we could move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So in addition, I just want to talk at a high level because there are also similar, but a bit varied certification requirements from CARB for zero emission vehicles. So any vehicle prior to manufacture that will be sold into California needs to obtain an executive order, and that applies for zero emission vehicles as well. And just like at the federal level, there's certification, reporting, and labeling requirements, but California has set up a little bit different path. There's two kind of processes, one for light duty and medium duty vehicles, and then another for heavy duty vehicles. And for both, the focus is less on emissions and it's more focused on energy usage and battery output and mileage range. But for light duty vehicles, the certification is at the EV, the electric vehicle manufacturer level. That party will obtain the executive order. But for heavy duty vehicles, the heavy duty vehicle manufacturer can obtain the certification, or California has implemented procedures for electric powertrain certification. So electric powertrain certification can happen at the powertrain level, which is a bit different from the federal, and it is a new procedure in the state of California as well. If we could move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So that was kind of a high-level overview of the certification requirements applicable prior to the manufacture of electric vehicles at the federal level and in California. Like I said, there's many more detailed requirements in the regulations about how that application is supposed to look and the things that need to be included, but wanted to highlight that there. Jumping forward, I want to turn now to environmental enforcement in this space, and some of what I'm going to talk about here may be less applicable to zero emission vehicles, but it's certainly applicable in the mobile source space, in the automotive space, and for non-road equipment, and is certainly top of mind as both California and EPA are enacting more stringent emission standards. So since 2015, when the Volkswagen matter came to light, EPA has identified mobile sources, vehicles, mobile equipment, emissions issues as a national compliance enforcement initiative. So they've been really focused on this area, and EPA has been sending out information requests under their Clean Air Act authority to many different parties, anyone and everyone, manufacturers of complete vehicles, incomplete vehicles, aftermarket part manufacturers, repair shops, looking for information on emissions. They've also instituted mandatory recalls in various emission cases, and a number of companies have done their own voluntary recalls under the regulations due to emissions issues. And just want to note that there are significant penalties or potential penalties in this area, upwards of $48,000 per violation or per day, depending on the type of non-compliance. So those are the maximum statutory penalties, but EPA does have a mobile source penalty policy, which applies specifically to mobile sources and emissions issues. That was recently updated in January 2021, where EPA and enforcement actions will generally start, short of litigation, will start with that policy and look at various criteria to assess what they think is a reasonable penalty, what economic benefit, the horsepower of the engine, if there's an engine involved, whether it's a labeling violation or an emissions violation. So that's out there. There are, just want to note, criminal provisions for violations of emissions regulations, knowing violations of emissions regulations. And CARB has separate enforcement authority. So even for a very similar issue, could be facing enforcement from EPA as well as CARB. While that said, CARB does often join EPA in some of the settlements and enforcement actions. They do work in tandem, but also wanted to note that they have their separate authority, and both EPA and CARB have voluntary disclosure policies that companies can take advantage of in if they meet certain criteria. If they detect an emissions issue and they want to voluntarily disclose it, there's certain penalty mitigation if the company meets the criteria. So those are some of the high level enforcement items wanted to highlight here for mobile sources and emissions issues, but wanted to also touch quickly on importation considerations in this space, and one in particular. So generally speaking, an individual or a company or a party can't import a vehicle from overseas into the US unless it has a valid EPA certificate of conformity saying that it's certified to emission standards here. And CARB has its own requirements as well. There are some exemptions and exceptions to that prohibition, one of which relevant here that we've seen come up here in this space is related to research, design, and testing. So for example, if a company or party wants to import a vehicle from overseas so that it can, you know, convert it to an electric vehicle or use it to prototype an electric vehicle. That is possible, but it requires advance approval from the EPA, and the EPA typically sets guidelines on what the use can be. They want to see what the test procedures are. They want to see what you'll be doing with it, and then typically they require export or destruction of the vehicle after the test program unless you're able to get it certified with the EPA. So wanted to highlight that, you know, there is coordination with EPA, and then also customs will be involved with, you know, importing those types of vehicles. And then finally, I just wanted to mention in terms of environmental enforcement, that, you know, the traditional, more traditional environmental considerations applied to the manufacture of these types of vehicles. For example, there was a recent Clean Air Act enforcement against Tesla for an air violation related to their painting operations. So the compliance, environmental compliance still applies in this area with respect to wastewater, waste management, all of that, the same it would for a manufacturer. So just wanted to highlight that as well. If we could move to the next slide. Okay, the next two topics I want to touch on here briefly, and I'll turn it over to Nick, could easily fall within the sustainability section of this program. So sorry, not trying to steal your thunder, Hillary, but I wanted to address them here as they do have an environmental regulatory connection, and they're certainly connected to the EV adoption push. So the first relates to battery recycling, which I know many of you have probably heard about and have been talking about with respect to, you know, the production and supply of lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. And currently there aren't any in the US. The EPA has not set any recycling requirements for lithium-ion batteries at the end of their life. However, there are US DOT and EPA requirements for transportation of lithium-ion batteries, generating and disposing of waste lithium-ion batteries at the federal level. There's just no federal recycling program. However, that said, there are a number of states like Minnesota and New York that have mandatory recycling programs and requirements. And many of these state programs relate to lead acid batteries, but we're seeing that some of the states are starting to pursue those same programs for lithium-ion batteries. And typically those programs will require the manufacturer of the battery or the retailer of the battery to take them back and recycle them. And given the developments in this area, we think it'll be likely, and EPA has already said that they recommend that lithium-ion batteries be recycled, but we think it's likely that there may be some regulations or programs put in place at the federal level for recycling of lithium-ion batteries. As you can see on the slide here, in 2020 and 2021, the Senate introduced some lithium-ion battery recycling bills, and in the Jobs Act, there's funding for research into lithium-ion battery recycling programs and funding for state and retailers to set up such recycling programs. So we think there'll be more activity in this space to come. And then just wanted to also highlight that in Europe, in the EU, there are current registration requirements for lithium-ion battery manufacturers, and there's also certain other requirements for disposers and recyclers of those batteries. We could move to the next slide. And then the last topic I wanted to touch on here, which isn't unique to electric vehicles, but certainly applies to electric vehicles, is the development of refrigerant regulation that's been happening recently, specifically under the American Innovation and Manufacturing Act, the AIM Act, which was part of a bill in 2020, that basically gave EPA the authority to regulate refrigerants. And these refrigerants are used widely in motor vehicle air conditioning systems, and not just ICE vehicles, but electric vehicles. So right now, that act requires the phase out of certain refrigerants particularly hydrofluorocarbons that have high global warming potential. And those types of refrigerants are, what are used in air conditioning systems right now. And so there's a schedule for phase down, and the EPA is, has issued recent rulemakings about phasing those out and has set production schedules for that. So wanted to flag that particularly because they are used so widely in motor vehicle air conditioning systems, and we're seeing there's already supply chain issues with the refrigerants, and as they're becoming phased out, we anticipate that they'll be harder and harder to find, and it takes some time to find a substitute and redesign your air conditioning systems. So with that, that's all I wanted to touch on from an environmental and regulatory perspective. So I will turn it over to Nick England, who's going to discuss NHTSA developments. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you, Amanda. I appreciate that. So my name is Nick England. I'm a special counsel attorney here in Washington, D.C. at Portfolio and Lardner. My practice area has primarily focused on NHTSA-related topics. I also do some other vehicle regulations around motor carriers, which would be at the Fmvss, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, as well as some of the state requirements as well. Let's see if I can get this to advance for me. While we're waiting for that, go ahead and advance the slide. I give the control back. So NHTSA, just a little bit of background on NHTSA and what they do while we're waiting for that slide to advance. NHTSA is the primary regulator of motor vehicles in the United States. They regulate the sale, or they regulate manufacturers, and they regulate any vehicle that their jurisdiction comes if it's sold or imported, or as they say, entered into interstate commerce in the United States. NHTSA's primary authorities involving manufacturers lie around safety standards, which are the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards. Most of you are probably familiar with these, but for those who are not, these are things like seatbelt requirements, braking, steering, lighting, etc., that are required on vehicles. Electric vehicles are subject to all the applicable Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards, depending on what kind of vehicle type they are, whether they're a light vehicle or a heavy vehicle, or fall within the definitions that NHTSA uses, or even motorcycles. There is one particular standard that applies to EVs, and that is to passenger vehicles or light vehicles. That's Fmvss 305. This is a rear impact test that's sort of the analog to Fmvss 301, which is for ICE, which is the fuel integrity standard. This particular standard, you can go to the next slide, deals with electrolyte spillage and electrical isolation of the battery. There's also some markings requirements, and there's also a service disconnect requirement in it. Again, these only apply to light vehicles. That's with a GVWR, that's gross vehicle weight rating of 4,536 kilograms or less, which is 10,000 pounds. That's also the cutoff for medium and heavy vehicles, which is where once they cross that threshold, they're typically being treated as commercial vehicles. NHTSA did announce in its fall 2021 Unified Regulatory Agenda that it's planning to update 305 to align with the Global Technical Regulation number 20 on electric vehicle safety. And that would include regulating heavy vehicles. They haven't published anything on that or a request for comment on what they plan to do. But the assumption is as the market for commercial vehicles increases that are using lithium-ion batteries and other or other components to make them electric vehicles, that NHTSA will look to expand 305 to have certain safety standards on those vehicles as well. Again, nothing is published at this time. Next slide, please. The other important aspect for a vehicle manufacturer of NHTSA is their safety-related defects requirements. Now, there's two parts to this. First is that there's an affirmative requirement on all motor vehicle manufacturers that if they find a product deficiency, that whether that's construction, design, materials, components, or even performance, that presents an unreasonable risk to accident or death, once they've made that determination, they must report it to NHTSA within 5 working days. NHTSA also has an investigation authority over trends that they see Usually it's based off of vehicle owner questionnaires that are reported to NHTSA, which is their complaint system, where they look at those to see if there's a potential issue out there. With regard to high voltage batteries, NHTSA has recently taken on a pretty keen focus on fires involving electric vehicles. You can see the recently enclosed investigation of the Bolt EV that resulted in 3 recalls around that. And again, NHTSA is actively monitoring its vehicle owner questionnaires to check for any kind of reports of fires that are out there. NHTSA also checks for media reports and reporting that comes in through other avenues that manufacturers required, like the early warning reporting requirements or technical service bulletins that are submitted to NHTSA under separate regulations. Go ahead and advance to the next slide. NHTSA also is developing changes to its NCAP system. This is the crash testing that NHTSA does that assigns one of the 5-star ratings that it issues to vehicles. NCAP includes a lot of safety features, some of which include information that's passed on to consumers. NHTSA published just last week an update to a proposal for updating its NCAP. And some of the comments that they specifically sought were how regenerative braking may impact forward collision warnings, crash imminent braking, and dynamic brake support. Now, these are what we call crash mitigation technologies, which are really a growing aspect of vehicles around. And what NHTSA is interested in is they don't have a lot of research at this point on what impact might happen as they start requiring things like forward collision warning, which are not required at the time, but NCAP is seen generally as a step towards developing safety standards towards that. And NHTSA wants to understand how those might interact with regenerative braking. For those of you who are in this space, it would be important to take a look at that NCAP proposal, see what kind of comments you might be interested in making, whether it's through your trade group or as your manufacturer individually. Again, NHTSA bases a lot of its determinations in NCAP on comments that it receives from manufacturers. Their understanding of technology generally is based off of what they've done in their own research or what's been shared with them by other manufacturers. So if you feel like they've covered that in some of the research that's available, or if your trade group has already worked with them, you want to make sure that those comments align with what happens with your particular technology or the way it might work in your vehicle. This happened a lot with the automatic emergency braking. There was not a rule that's been in place on that, but it's agreed with with manufacturers in sort of a informal agreement that they would put those in, that manufacturers would put those in vehicles. And there was a few manufacturers who got caught a little bit flat-footed when they realized that the technologies or agreements that they were putting together with NHTSA didn't quite align with the type of technologies that they were developing. So it's important to pay attention to these rulemakings to ensure that you're not getting kind of boxed into a corner with the way the rulemakings are developing. And just a couple of quick comments before I close as well. There are some consumer information that's required by the Monroney label, which is that label you see in a new car. That only applies to passenger vehicles, but for EVs, there is a formula that needs to follow that works with EPA and NHTSA jointly in terms of an estimated electric miles per gallon that translates over, and some of the information that Amanda mentioned earlier about range and others that's required on those labels. So there's a little bit of crossover in those terms between NHTSA and EPA. They work closely together in developing those. So now I'll turn the time over to Hillary.
Hillary, before we move on, I believe now we have the CLE code. Dwana, can you advance the slide? Thank you. If you're seeking CLE credit today, please record the following code, YRWFG, on your attorney affirmation form. Again, it's Y as in yellow, R as in Roger, W as in whiskey, F as in Frank, G as in golf, on your attorney affirmation form, and return it to sambisecker@foley.com. You can also put your name and your email and the code in the chat, and we will have it recorded that way as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. And yes, we will spend the last 5 minutes or so talking about some sustainability considerations for vehicles. I'm going to try and shorten up my comments just so we can hopefully get a couple questions in if we have time. So just speaking briefly about some sustainability initiatives in the automotive space. There's a relatively new initiative called the Circular Cars Initiative by the World Economic Forum, which is looking for opportunities to establish closed loop recycling of aluminum and steel from vehicles, and that is aimed towards circular economy ideas. Aluminum is important specifically because it is extremely costly and resource intensive to mine, but it's virtually infinitely recyclable. Global demand for aluminum is projected to grow up by more than 80% by 2050. So recycled aluminum is important because it uses only 5% of the energy that is required for primary production to produce. There's some sustainability initiatives relating to plastic, particularly water bottles. Automakers are using recycled water bottles in a variety of ways, including wiring harness clips made from plastic bottles and fishing nets and some underbody shields. There are also some post-consumer fabrics being used, such as post-consumer discarded carpet and recycled tires for interior car components, fabric offcuts from clothing manufacturers. Again, abandoned fishing nets are being used. There's a new material that is made from recycled industrial plastic that is used for floor mats and other trim. There are other initiatives around creating cover seats from recycled plastic, and then also compressed timber products, such as floor and dashboard trim. There's also a movement towards using more natural fibers with the idea that natural fibers consume less material and energy to use than synthetic fibers. And in 2015, about 50,000 tons of natural fiber in the automotive industry, of which about 20% was hemp. So we can talk briefly about tires. Nearly 250 million scrap tires are generated annually in the U.S. alone, making this one of the most historically least sustainable parts of a vehicle. The U.S. Tire Manufacturers Association is working towards eliminating historical scrap tire stockpiles while at the same time growing a scrap tire market. And these markets include reuses such as landfill covers, railroad lines, rubberized floors and asphalt, and playgrounds. There's also some initiatives around using things like oils from sunflowers and natural latex rubbers in tires. And there are more uses for recycling tires in the automotive industry as a closed loop idea than just tires. They are also being made into conveyor belts, things like conveyor belts and anti-vibration products. So we can go to the next slide. That talks about legal considerations, regulatory changes. So not all movements are just feel-good voluntary efforts made by companies. While the Circular Car Initiative I mentioned previously is voluntary, a European Union directive called End-of-Life Vehicles requires member states to implement measures aimed at the prevention of waste from vehicles, aims at the reuse, recycling, and other forms of recovery for end-of-life vehicles. And the goal is to reduce the disposal of waste and improve the environmental performance of economic operators, particularly for end-of-life vehicles. So in the EU, that is not voluntary, that is a directive. And then quickly on environmental, social, and governance, ESG. If you're familiar with ESG, you know that Europe is generally farther ahead in the US and is more aggressive on initiatives and reporting and disclosures. And that's just as true for the automotive industry as any other industry. So just quickly on ESG, in many investors' eyes, sustainable choices can demonstrate a business's financial sustainability. And through ESG reporting, companies can demonstrate that they are mitigating significant risks like resource shortages, which goes back to the circular economy idea that we were talking about earlier. Sustainability claims, including claims used in marketing and promotion, as well as ESG reporting, must be thoroughly vetted in order to reduce potential exposure to things like greenwashing litigation. Companies should generally avoid broad claims like sustainable or clean or consumer conscious, and should instead clarify and quantify the kinds of sustainability benefits that their products can achieve and are achieving. And importantly, companies must develop and maintain robust documentation that supports any sustainability claims that they are making. Lastly, in many instances, supply chain management will be critical to achieving sustainability goals while minimizing accompanying risks. However, please keep in mind that sustainable sourcing contracts and processes may need to address different risks than traditional supply chain agreements. For example, contracts addressing supply of reclaimed materials should also address sustainability specific terms and conditions like restricted or prohibited sources and post-consumer content composition. And I'll end my comments there. I have a few more notes on this, but I just want to make sure that we end on time and are respectful of your time and if there are any questions. So Mary, I will throw it back to you.
Thank you. We do have one question from the audience, and this is for Amanda. They asked if you could please repeat the increased market share by 2026 up to 7% to 17%. Is that new car sales?
Oh, yeah, yes, that relates to new car sales. And I think the projection of the 7% was for 2023. And EPA said by 2026, they would anticipate new car sales to make up 17% of sales to meet those new emission standards.
Awesome, thank you. And then we have one for Hillary. Do you have any insights on the SEC GHG reporting proposal?
It's a great question. I don't have any specific insights on that at this time. I know the SEC is making a lot of movements and proposals, and we're expecting more in the coming weeks. But I don't have any specific thoughts on the reporting proposal at this time, though I believe we will be putting out some client alerts and other information from Foley's team on these developments. So stay tuned.
Thank you, Hillary. And if we don't have any other questions from the audience via our chat, that will conclude our webinar for today. Okay, looks like that concludes our webinar. Thank you all for attending, and please let us know if you have any additional questions.